I have a lot of weird encounters outside my office on my smoke breaks, but I think this one takes the cake, even with how anticlimactic it was. Today I was sitting on the wall outside my building smoking and messing around on my phone. I had probably been sitting there for about 2 minutes without looking up. When I finally do, I notice a guy on the corner about 20 feet away staring intently at me. He's hunched over, facing me in the classic zombie pose, wearing a large coat, a surgical mask, and gloves. I don't know how long he'd been standing there, but it was daytime, and the area is relatively populated, so despite being the only people on the street, I wasn't too worried. I went back to looking at my phone, but kept discreetly glancing in his direction to see if he was still there. He didn't move, or stop looking at me for probably a minute and a half, just sunken shoulders with his unblinking eyes pointed directly at me over his mask. Finally, I noticed an older man walking towards us, and my cigarette is almost finished, so I assume worst comes to worst, this guy will be near if anything happens. I glance back at my phone and hear what I assume are the older man's footsteps approaching. Before I have a chance to look up, the surgical zombie is sitting within an inch of me on the wall. I'm a polite girl, so I give him a vague smile, while my inner self and personal space are screaming at me to get up and leave. He asks me for a cigarette, so I give him one, and he just continues to sit there with it unlit. I can't fight my manners, so I ask him if he needs a light, and he gives me a gloved double thumbs up and stares at me. I ask him if that means he had one, to which he responds with another double thumbs up. I assume that was him saying he did, so I turn my back to my phone, planning on taking one more drag before getting up to leave. He then says, "Yes, I need one." So I give him my lighter, he hands it back, and I put my smoke out and stand up. He then begins laughing, like full belly laughing. I didn't really know how to respond, so I tell him to have a nice day and walk into my building. To be honest, I've never really had a fear of people, and I can't say this is the first time I've had someone has done something like this, but the mask and gloves really added to the absurdity of the situation. It's Friday night, at around 8:45 p.m. The little one's in bed, and I'm chilling with some friends online, gaming. There's a loud bang, and I'm instantly freaked out due to having my home, my safe place, invaded by some creeper twice in the past 3 months. I turn the volume on my computer down, trying my best to come up with excuses. Oh, it was the neighbors doing something. Who's in their right mind would try to break into my house when they can see that I'm awake? Front outdoor light on, lounge lit on. It's quiet for a while, so I return to playing the game and talking to my friends. That's when I hear rustling. I think it's coming from the game, despite the volume being super low, but to be on the safe side, I turn the volume on the computer off completely. The rustling's still there. At this point, I think it might be that annoying pest possum. The banging could have been it jumping onto the garbage roof, and now it was scuffling around outside the leaves, searching for some food. As I said earlier, who would try to trespass when they could clearly see someone was home? If they did trespass, why would they be doing it so loudly? I want to say it put me at ease, but it didn't. Fast forward half an hour and the noises have stopped, and my cat's begging me to let outside. Little bastard. I love him, really. I hate opening doors, curtains, windows at night. Paranoia at its finest. But tonight I had some reason to be paranoid. At least I kept the chain lock on the door and let the fat fuzzball squeeze out, and had a peek through the crack, seeing if anything was amiss on the front lawn. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I locked the door and head back to the lounge. 5 minutes later, someone tries the door handle. Finding it locked, I hear a laugh and they start scratching on the glass as I frantically grab my phone and call the police. Whoever it was that had left by the time they answered the phone, the police couldn't find evidence that anyone had been on the property. They did a sweep of the neighborhood, but couldn't find anyone on the street either. Whoever you are, I'd say let's not meet, but I'm pretty sure you're the same person who came the other 2 times. and I'm fairly certain that the person is my ex. So, Mr. X, if it is you, smile for the cameras next time you come around. They just arrived in my mailbox. I've stalked this sub for a while, and couldn't decide whether or not to post mine, but I'm feeling brave on a Monday. It was a very long time ago, back in 1973. I know it was summer, I was 6, and we were living on Monica Lane in Madison, Wisconsin. Thing is, I sort of recalled it, but never put 2 and 2 together until a few months ago, when I was talking to my mom, who went into the great detail. I was a very gregarious child, outgoing, extroverted friends, play with anyone. It was at the time a middle-class neighborhood, and 3 houses down from ours on the same side of the street was a huge park. My mom was a nurse and my dad was a salesman, but mom worked second shift at Marriott, while my dad worked days. I really had a babysitter, only if they went out for dinner or a movie, but they did go out often and there were always older kids in the neighborhood to babysit. One sitter who I really liked lived a few blocks or so away, and down the street a little bit. Vicky had babysat a few times before that, and it was very uneventful. She played games with me, and do my hair, play dress up, pretty basic stuff. So anyhow, one day I had gone with friends down to the park. I remember there was a ball field at the time, and the sandlot next to the field. My friends wanted to play in the monkey bars, but I wanted to play in the sand. I looked at the sandbox and my babysitter Vicky was standing there. I told my friends I was going down to the sandbox and I ran off. We played in the sand, building a castle, and then she asked if I wanted to go get something cold to drink. It was stifling hot, and of course I said yes. So she takes my hand and we started walking to her place. She starts telling me about her puppies and asking if I want to play with them. Of course I get giddy and now I can't wait to get to her house. This was where my memory had stopped, and after my mom told me what happened, the rest of it flooded back. My mother just happened to be talking to my sister about some of the places we lived, and we got to Monica Lane. I told her I remember the park and how big it seemed, and she asked if I remember being kidnapped. I immediately thought she was kidding, and then look on her face told me otherwise. She said it was around 5 in the afternoon, and one of my friends had come to the door to ask me to come back outside. Sure that I had gotten bored and walked back home. When my mom checked the house, she realized I wasn't there. 7 months pregnant with my sister, sprints to the park screaming my name. After asking several kids if they had seen me with no clue, she went to the ball field and asked the older boys if they had seen me. One of the boys, she guessed around 14, said she had seen a younger woman playing with a girl that fit my description in the sand, and walked off in a general direction. That was all she knew. My mom ran across the street to one of the houses and asked to use her phone to call the police. By the time the police got there, my dad had come home and some of the neighbors were trying to help my mom. So there's this search party out looking for me, screaming my name and knocking on doors. The police had gone back to the park to ask the boys if they knew who had been with me and if they knew who she was. Between the boys and the neighbors, they had deducted who it was and had led me off. But I have no idea how, honestly. The police and the entourage go to her home. She lived with her parents, but they weren't home, and knock on the door. She came to the door and told them she hadn't seen me, and that she'd been home all day. The police asked to come in, and for some reason she said okay. They went through the house and went to the basement and found me. That's what my mom knew, and then I remembered. It was literally like a floodgate had opened, and I started crying. At 6, you sort of trust everyone, and she'd been in our home. I've never got a bad feeling from her, and my parents didn't either. But when we walked into her house, I remember that cold, holy fuck feeling washing over me and getting very worried. I remember starting to cry and saying I wanted to go home over and over. She takes me into her kitchen and gets me a glass of water and a tissue. I hear dogs barking, and next to the kitchen is an open stairway that goes down, and where the barking was coming from. She starts trying to cajole me into going downstairs, telling me there's all sorts of toys and games. I reluctantly agree, and she grabs my hand and heads downstairs. The dogs are going nuttier, and I start screaming. At this point, Vicky is getting fucking bizarre. She screams at me to shut the fuck up. If you don't shut up, I will throw you in the cage with the dogs, and they will eat you. Shut up. Dragging me down the stairs and still screaming. I was scared out of my mind. I remember crying so hard I was hyperventilating, and I'm screaming so hard I'm not making sounds. Vicky then flips a switch and starts being syrupy sweet. Trying to calm me down, she tells me that she was just playing a game and tells me she wants to play hide and seek. She must have been relatively skilled at calming me down, because the next thing I know, I hear knocking on the door upstairs, and I wasn't crying. The house were all the same sort of tract house that Sears used to sell, not huge but not small, but you could hear everything at any spot in the house. I kept hearing the knocking, and she tells me that it's her friends. They're coming to play hide and seek. She's convinced me to let her put a piece of masking tape over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound, and lifted me into the big wooden box next to the kennel. She put a big pile of blankets over me and told me to be really quiet so they didn't find me. The whole time the dogs were going batshit, but when she calmed me down, they calmed down too. They still looked incredibly mean, but they were no longer frothing at the mouth and only slightly growling until the knocking started. I remember scrunching in there, confused, still scared and convinced that the dogs were going to get out and eat me. I was crying again and hyperventilating. I remember taking the tape off my mouth because I couldn't breathe, but remember I needed to be quiet because I was afraid what she'd do if I screamed. I laid in that smelly box next to a big bag of dog food, sweating to hell, tears rolling down my face. I sort of pushed the blankets to the side, but only enough that I could pull them back over me when someone came. I recall thinking about my dad and wondering if he'd come find me. All of a sudden I hear what sounds like adults yelling my name. They come down the stairs and the dogs are going batshit again. Over and over men are yelling my name, and then I hear a man say, "If you don't shut those fucking dogs up, I will." I was in a large storage box, like a carpenter's toolbox type of thing, with tape hanging off my mouth. When they opened the lid, I remember a very nice man asking me my name and if I was okay. I don't remember answering him in any other than screams and tears and grabbing his neck so hard my dad had to pry me off. I remember my parents taking me to the hospital to be checked out, and that's all I really remember. Mom said that Vicky was found guilty of attempted kidnapping, and last she knew was in prison, but couldn't remember when the last time she had heard anything. We moved from that area shortly thereafter, and I haven't been back since. I do know that my mom said that her parents were odd, and they didn't know them. She had met Vicky from neighbors that had used her as a babysitter, and had never heard anything bad, and that always seemed happy with her. She lived in a general neighborhood, but it would have been 2 blocks over, and 1 block down. Mom said they never picked her up. She always walked over. When they'd get home, they'd drive her home, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary. Mom and Dad had only met her parents when they came to the door to ask for forgiveness, that Vicky hadn't meant to do anything bad, and was a good girl. Mom said my dad picked her up by the shirt and told him that if they ever came to the property again, he'd kill them. I remember her name and sort of what she looked like, but would have no idea if she walked up to me who she is. The other day at work, we were basically told to look out for ourselves and others, wait for security guard, etc. Now this was a normal thing for the suburb we lived in, but it was still a bit strange. My friends from Nightville told me why. Their friend and coworker finished up around 12 that morning and was approached by this guy when he was in his car. The guy looked pretty normal, track keys and all, and gave him an envelope claiming there were free Fringe tickets inside. Side note for clarification, Fringe is an art festival like music and comedy and dancing, etc. in the CBD. There was some sort of white powder on the tickets, but he just assumed it was cocaine or something. Again, not uncommon in this area, so just grabbed it, planning to throw it out later because it was probably counterfeit. Not wanting to spark any conflict, it's unpredictable around here, especially around 12 a.m. His mate came out and around 12:15 to see him with something like burns on his hands, where he touched the powder. He felt like he was burning on the inside and couldn't breathe properly. Luckily, he was still conscious and told him to take him to the hospital, which luckily wasn't that far away. They got there, and practically everyone that came into contact with him felt like they were burning under the skin and and were all having breathing difficulties within minutes. They had to call hazmat, fireys, and everyone was decontaminated. Luckily, everyone is okay. Around 9 p.m., I heard the telltale rumble that meant the forecast storm was about to start. I couldn't recall if I had rolled up my car window when I got home, so I went out to check. It was already dark out, and I live in a part of town that isn't big on streetlights, so at night sometimes it's hard to even stay on the sidewalk without crashing into bushes. The dumpsters are about 200 to 300 feet from my car, on our U-shaped street, tucked into a corner that backs into trees and a small creek. I live on the back of the building, so once I round the corner, you can't see me from my car nor the dumpsters. I got out to my car. As I rounded that corner, I could see what looked like a flashlight in the dumpster. Weird, but not alarming, as there are a lot of teenagers and younger boys who fuck around in that corner of the parking lot. My window was down a bit. As I rolled it up, I hear a clattering sound from the dumpsters. I turned to see someone climbing out of the dumpsters and start shining the light in the other dumpsters. My daughter had left her window down too, so I walked around to her door and rolled up her window too. I slammed the door shut a bit harder than I meant to, and since I was facing the dumpsters, I could see the dumpster man freeze and swing his light in my direction. He immediately switched it off, and right as I started to walk back inside, he started full-on sprinting towards my direction. My usually sedentary butt has never moved so fast. As I noped back onto the sidewalk and into the back of the building, I quietly opened and shut my door, locked in hopes that with 8 apartments back here, he wouldn't know where I was. Or maybe he was running for reasons entirely unrelated to me. Or maybe he was just fucking with me, and is now having a laugh with his friends about the lady he just scared the shit out of. Whatever it was, I'm sure as shit not getting any sleep tonight. This past weekend, my soon-to-be wife, Alexia, and I had just settled down for the night of movies, pizza, and cuddling. We lived in a residential area right outside of town, our home situation right across from the street of the Presbyterian church with a very large cemetery behind it. Most of our neighbors don't own pets, but there's one in particular across the street and downwards a bit, who owns perhaps the loudest, most annoying dog to ever exist. Quite an annoyance on a night like tonight, but luckily it was quiet for the entire evening. It's around 10 p.m. We're laying down watching our film in our living room when the loudest dog on earth begins to go off. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do, except maybe confront our neighbors, or file a noise complaint, but who wants to be the neighbor that does that? After about 5 minutes, I get up off the couch and decide to walk over to the neighbor's home and say something about the dog. As I head outside and made it to their driveway, unfortunately I noticed that the neighbor wasn't home. Their only car not there. I decided anyway to walk up to the door and ring the bell. After a minute, no one answering, I gave up and head back towards home. I noticed that Alexia has stepped outside and was looking on towards the direction of the barking. I told her that no one was home and that we should either ignore it or file a complaint. No one should have to deal with a loud dog at night, especially if you're trying to unwind after a long day of work or trying to sleep. Alexia and I head back inside for a bit, and finally after about 10 minutes the dog ceases to bark. Alexa and I exhaled and laughed a bit before continuing our film, but of course not long after the dog starts up again. This time it sounded vicious. I got up, went outside and approached our neighbor's fence off backyard and saw the dog, who must have heard or saw me coming. It stopped barking, walked up to me and began to pant in the cute way dogs do. I chuckled and said the dog's name, to which he looked at me and sat down. Such a good animal, even if he's being so loud. I then heard something that sounded like somebody walking through leaves coming from behind me and to the right. I turned to see somebody looking at me from behind a gravestone in the cemetery. The dog must have heard this as well, as it sprung up and began to bark in the direction of the gravestone. I looked on at the person continuing staring at them in my direction as the dog continued to bark. I looked towards my house where I saw Alexa standing near her car, looking at me with a confused look on her face. I looked in horror as I saw the person reveal himself from behind the gravestone. His forehead and cheek were stained red with blood, dripping down off his chin, and in his hand was some sort of dagger. The dog began to go ballistic as the person took a few steps in our direction before stopping. I turned to the dog, and then back at my home, Alexa, who was still outside, yelled to me what was wrong. I told her to call the police. She said, "Why, the dog?" To which I replied, "He's fucking armed." Probably confused. Alexa went inside to grab her phone as I continued to watch on as the person now began to back off. The dog was going berserk. It was going to take a bit of time before someone could reach our home, so I readied myself to go into self-defense as I watched the man finally turn around and walk away towards the back of the cemetery towards the woods. When the police finally arrived, the person was long gone, and I was stuck there explaining to a couple of skeptical officers about my encounter. They didn't seem to take me that seriously, but still investigated the area as I explained to Alexa about the person I saw. When the police left after finding no trace of anyone, Alexa and I didn't feel much better. We locked our doors and windows, and I decided to call our neighbors to fill them in on everything before heading back to continue our movie night in spectacular fashion with The Exorcist. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks, where you'd do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. It was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm, cleaning bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy, who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day the temperatures hit around 38 degrees Celsius, around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of the watering hole on the farm about 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the hour. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide empty expanse with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. He said, "Do you see that over there? Between those 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red, and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we see a large blue, angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it there when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially we pulled off to stop around 100 meters away from it. At this stage I had really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood given it was his property, but in truth I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated, so they buzzed from side to side following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along with the lines of, "With all this security, someone's obviously doesn't want us here, just let's go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me that it was his farm and whoever put it here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was a rush of cool air. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when you hear a hard drive working hard. When I finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges, and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage bins scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of the nonsensical dreams. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to bolt. We had seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew where we were. Jeremy, on the other, was adamant that we get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it is from a lay position is that it was endless list computer talk. It's like the old Napster or LimeWire download screens looked like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, and then recording it in on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container to the big pile of storage boxes. By then, I was pretty sure no one else was there, and there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided against my better judgment to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief shift through the box still makes me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize it was child pornography. One thing that still gets to me is all neatly ordered in folders and smaller boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled and jumped up and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back in the truck and sped to the house. The farm had no mobile reception, and we hadn't brought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about half an hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, very remote. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in them and led them back. This is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open and there was a fire inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the car, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage had already been done. The arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of computer equipment it described, the only traces of paper and of cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge, so there were no real ways to tell them, since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first place, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone. Area surveillance was also impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up with no real evidence of who might be responsible. The investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still there on the farm. It's too expensive to move.